Hey, good afternoon everyone. So what's new with Bicep? Well, the answer is a lot. Kind of depending on how far you go back. But I think if you look like 12 to 18 months back, there are quite a lot of new things that are happening in the infrastructure as code space in Azure that we're going to be talking about today. Now, before I dive in, I have an important question. Who here has experience with Bicep? Fantastic. Who doesn't? And I'm not going to ridicule you, but I'm not going to do like the 101. So I hope you can tag along, and if you really have any questions, just heckle and shout, which is apparently the general tradition here at IglooConf. Feel free to ask questions, but I'm going to step over the basics. Who am I? I'm Henry. And there's a lot of stuff I do. One thing that I want to point out is that I created a new course on infrastructure as code for Azure on Pluralsight. Now, if you're not a Pluralsight subscriber and you do want to watch the course, come find me and I'll hook you up with a trial code, which should last you 30 days, which should be enough to watch the course. I mean, you go to conferences to get free shit, right? Well, this is free shit. Come find me. And I also wanted to share something about myself, and not my very short, non-impressive career, but something that is defining for my life. This is my house 2 years ago. We bought a very, very ugly, terrible house at a fantastic location 3.5 years ago. And we had a contractor in for 2 months, and this is what he got to at that point. So this is the worst that has happened to me in those 2.5 years, was the bottom line. And from there on, it got worse. Half of the wall at the back was removed. But from there on, it slowly started getting better. It's a very special house. It's a Dutch-style house. We call it a stolp, which means that except from the walls, everything leans on 4 poles in the center of the house. Everything was taken out, and here you see the first part of a new bit of house being moved in by the contractor. So the contractor put in 4 rooms like that, and then he left. And not because he wanted to, but because I kicked him out. And I said, I will finish this myself. So this is my attic. 2 months ago, after me spending a couple of weeks isolating everything and almost being done putting plastic in. And this is the picture that I took last week. So I'm now slowly building my own house from top to bottom. So I thought that's maybe something interesting about me, not technical. So back to technology. What is new with Bicep? Quite a lot. And I thought about how to go about this talk, and I thought, let's try to not make it a talk. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go over a number of things that are new, very quickly discuss them, hopefully within a couple of minutes, and then turn over to you and ask, what do you want to see, or maybe what do you want to build together? So if you don't say anything, or you say Kubernetes, this is going to be a very short session, but if there are things that you want to do together in Bicep, possibly with the things that we talked about, we can do that until we're kicked out of the room to make room for the next presenter. This is the question that I tried to start with. Of course, nobody loves PowerPoint, but unfortunately that's a screenshot. What we're going to be talking about is, I'm going to start with something awesome that was released about a week and a half ago, which is support for accessing Entra ID through Bicep. And if you're a Bicep user, this is probably one of the things that you have been waiting for. And then the other things that I can talk to you about are parameters. In Bicep, for quite a while, we didn't have Bicep parameter files. We still had to create those horrific JSON thingies and then combine them with the Bicep file. There's something better now. If you haven't seen it yet, I can show you. And we now have support for user-defined types, which allow you to create your own complex types. For example, 2 strings that have a meaningful name, or a Boolean and a string, something to enable a feature and to name it. We can take a look at how that works, and also at how you can share that between multiple files by exporting or importing those types. There is a bicep config JSON file. I don't know why that's still JSON, but it's in JSON. We can talk about that and see how you can play with the linter, increase some warnings into errors, or maybe silence some warnings. Then there is another thing that's currently in preview, so that hasn't been GA'd yet, and that's support for resource-typed parameters and outputs. So if you're creating complex infrastructures where you're creating a resource in one file and then want to reuse it in another one, in the past you would probably pass along and the name and the ID and maybe one or two properties of that resource you just created. Now you can just pass along the complete resource. We can take a look at how that worked. And then there are three other things for which I had diagrams, which is what the asterisk is for, just a reminder for myself. And one thing that we can talk about is the Bicep registry. And what this allows you to do is, instead of taking your template and publishing it into Azure to create resources, is to publish the template itself. And that Bicep registry is nothing but a repurposed Azure Container Registry. So you create an Azure Container Registry, push your templates in there, and then other people who write another Bicep template can reference that template in the registry and reuse it in their own template to create Azure resources. Another way for creating and publishing templates is by deploying them as a template spec. So template spec is a little bit different than a Bicep registry because the template spec is a resource in itself in Azure. It's something that you see in the portal instead of it being hidden in an Azure Container Registry. So you can publish a template as a template spec, and then you can go into the portal, for reasons unknown to me, and directly from the portal deploy that template to create Azure resources. But of course, the other thing you can do is you can reference that template spec from another Bicep template and then reuse that from a central location to create Azure resources. So two different technologies that solve very similar problems. The third thing that was recently GA'd is deployment stacks. Now, let me start with a problem. If you have been using templates in Azure for a while, you've probably run into the problem that a template will help you create new resources. It will help you remediate configuration drift by resetting properties to the properties defined in your template after some person went into the portal and changed them out of the infrastructure as code. But what it didn't do was clean up resources or remove resources. And if your memory goes back even further, you might say, well, that's not completely true, Henry, because we also have something called complete deployment mode, which would remove resources in a resource group you're deploying a template to if they're not defined in your template. That was a hot mess, because a lot of resource types weren't actually removed by a complete deployment. I gave you alert rules, for example. Another problem was, what if two persons deploy to the same resource group using different templates, and then one of them starts using complete mode? They would evict all the resources from the other entry point. Deployment stacks are the solution to that problem. A deployment stack is another grouping mechanism in Azure that allows you to draw a line around a group of resources and group it together as a stack. And that's a terminology you also see in other technologies like, for example, Pulumi or AWS CloudFormation. And what you say is, hey, whenever I redeploy this stack, I want you to create resources, update resources, but also think about how to remove resources from Azure that are no longer in my template. So let's assume we have an empty Azure environment and we're going to deploy a template using an app service and a SQL database. And we make that a stack. Then we get this line around those resources in Azure. But what if we already have a resource in Azure and then deploy the same template as a stack? The outcome would be the same, because we're still creating or updating resources. But now it gets interesting. What if we have 3 resources in Azure in that stack, including the resource type that I hate the most, a virtual machine? So we're going to deploy a new template again with that app service and the SQL database. What will happen now is that the stack will be shrunk to only encapsulate those 2 resources, and the virtual machine is shown as what is called a detached resource. We can now go into the portal, we can now go into the Azure CLI or APIs and find detached resources and consider them for removing. So this is more like a soft delete or a mark for deletion scenario. Another thing you can do with a stack deployment is add a flag called -delete resources. And yes, this does what you expect it to do. It will look at the template that you're deploying, at the current state of your stack, and if there are resources not in your template, but in your stack, it will remove them, both from your stack and from Azure. And this is a way for having controlled deletions in Azure, because it will not mess with your complete deployment scope, the resource group. It will only mess with the resources that you have declared to be part of your stack earlier. Another thing that you can do with deployment stacks is that you can lock the stack against changes. So for example, you can say nobody can change this stack except this one principle, which of course is your deployment pipeline principle of identity. This is the combination of template stacks and deployment stacks is positioned as the replacement of Azure blueprints. If you're using infrastructure as code to create maybe a landing zone or an enterprise a COF implementation, you're now using blueprints. They have been in preview for 25,000 years or so. They will not see general availability. They will stay in preview until they are deprecated. Actually, I think they're already officially deprecated, or at least notice is given that they're going to be replaced by template stacks in combination with deployment stacks. Yeah, and a scenario here that you might use is, for example, from hey, we are an application team and we're deploying an app service with a SQL DB, and we want to connect it to the central virtual network because we need to access a resource from somebody else. So what you're going to do, you're going to create private endpoints to those resources, experience all the joys that Rick talked about earlier, and then connect that to a virtual network of your own. And then you want to pair that virtual network in that application resource group with the central network. Now the central team probably wants to take control of that virtual network and some resources around it. Because if you make a screw up there, it's going to impact not only your own application, but also other applications or services connected to that central network. So this is a way for a central team to deploy decentral virtual networks, spokes, and lock them against unwanted changes by application teams, but still allowing them to connect devices to them. The final thing that has more recently become available is user-defined functions. It's not a very large feature, but if you do a lot of string manipulation in templates, it can be a very handy trick. Now, not listed here, and for everyone watching this screen, what I'm going to share now is part of my Pluralsight training. I can use that here, if I mention that. So what I also have is a more elaborate Bicep demo where I deploy a central network, a decentral spokes, a routing table. So a bit of a larger example that we can walk through if you want to get some feeling for how a larger example would look like. So, what do you want to do?
User-defined types.
User-defined types?
Yeah.
All right, one nomination for user-defined types. Anyone else?
Deployment stacks, some examples of those.
Deployment stacks, all right. Anything else? So I'm not going to open a GitHub repository and going to work together with you, but feel free to join in, point out mistakes I make. I'm just going to try and make this work together with you.
Maybe template specs as well as an example how it shows up in the portal and like how can you reuse it.
All right, so user-defined types, template specs, and deployment stacks. Should be able to fit that in. Anything else? You're all familiar with parameter files? Okay, cool. If you're not, look them up. I find them a very nice, convenient addition. All right. Let's do something ridiculous. Open a new screen. And create a new file. And let's call it, say, temp polarbear.bicep. Now I'm going to quickly bring something over to make sure you don't watch me typing all the time. I'm going to bring over a app service plan containing an app service and some configuration. So this should be a valid file. Let's make it, let's say setting 1 is awesome value. And then of course enable more awesome stuff is false. Nobody likes awesome stuff. And let's say var location is resource group. That's location. This should be a valid template, I think. Now the problem that we are seeing here, at least I find the problem, is that we're going to build a collection of key values that contains the configuration for my app service. And of course this list can grow over time, so something else is added here as well. And now some kind of thing starts happening that instead of providing the values here, we're going to say something like sdfkj value, and we want to take that as a parameter to this template. And we're going to say param enable awesome feature, which is going to be a boolean. And then we're going to use this value here. And in any real world application, this can quickly grow to 10 or 20 values. Now, of course, putting all those values there, declaring them as a parameter, in a calling file, adding them as a value to the module deployment, and maybe 2 or 3 layers deep, is very annoying. So what will a developer do? It will say, well, you know what? This is an properties value. It's going to create one. This is what I see a lot of engineers do in practice. Because this makes it much easier. They don't have to type as much, and they know which settings go into that object when they create the outer template. Right? Everybody following along with that reasoning? Yeah, so that reasoning sucks. Because somebody else comes in after that genius developer and he's like, what are valid properties on the configuration object? They don't know because they didn't create the API. They just have to expand upon it. The problem is that object is pretty untyped. So we're going to create our own type. And we're going to say my app service configuration type is going to, well, we have of course awesome feature enabled, which should be a boolean, and we have the sdfkj value, which should be a string. And now we can say, hey, instead of this being an object, we can make this of type my app service configuration type. Now this postfix type is not mandatory. Actually, I don't really like adding what something is to the name of the variable, but what it allows me to do is this, because they share a namespace. And now all of a sudden I have a typed declaration of the properties that go as a parameter into this template. So if I now create a new file, and I call that polarbeer.parameters.bicep. See how I'm sneaking in parameter files. I can reference just kidding. We're going to call it temp/polarbeer.bicep param. Sorry, that was a JSON reflex coming up. And now I can say, hey, I'm going to provide values for this bicep file, polarbeer.bicep. And it's going to say, hey, there are errors here, because there are mandatory parameters that you didn't specify. And as you expect from any cool editor, it can generate those entries for me. And here I now have to specify the value for that object. However, I don't, well, actually I'm already getting auto-completion, which is nice. So let's call this true, and let's give this the name awesome feature. So this now I have declared a type, I get tab completion, and if I transform this by accident into a string, I get error. So I've added type safety to my parameter objects. Now one of the things that you might want to do is share these definitions between files. That's not possible by default, but there is a keyword that you can add, or an annotation I should say, which is called @export, which exports the type, which is a syntax that you might know from TypeScript. And I can now create another bicep file with an even better name. And I can now say import star, let's make it more precise, let's import my app service configuration type from polarbear.bicep. And now I can make a parameter of that type here as well. So you can create a bicep file with all your type definitions, if that's what's working for you, and then reuse that across your different files. That's user-defined types. Questions? Thoughts? Who thinks this is a valuable addition? Okay. Who thinks object is fine? I'm the only developer in the team. Okay. Well, I've had a lot of discussions with engineers that didn't understand the problem of untyped resources because they, well, we frankly didn't agree.
So if you wouldn't have this feature, how would you implement it not using the object?
So what I do is the only way for this to have type safety and transfer meaning to the person that has to provide the parameter values is by listing them separately. And then, for example, you can do some smart things with namespacing like, I don't know, app service configuration, dash setting 1, dash setting 2. But the consequence, of course, doing something with dashes or even dots is that you will have to quote the keys in the configuration. So it doesn't get prettier, but I do have to transfer meaning and context around the values that have to be provided to the person that's providing the parameter values. So this is a great addition. And in the latest versions of Bicep, this is now generally available. So I didn't have to enable any experimental feature. Some people might not know, but the Bicep executable doesn't upgrade automatically. So you have to AZ Bicep upgrade every now and then manually to get the latest version. Pro tip, saving you 4 minutes right now. Also do it on your build server. Learned that the hard way. Any questions? Template specs? I'm here for you. I'm here to give you what you want. That is what I'm trying to achieve with this approach. So feel free to shout and ask questions. So we have declared this template. Template specs are actually still in JSON, not in Bicep. So to avoid a blamage of myself on stage, I'm going to remove the custom type because I don't think that works yet with template specs. Oh, Henry. So this is again a valid template. So what we now can do is we can say AZ, TS, and then I don't know anymore. So we can add help, and then AZ, TS, and then it is create. We're going to create a template spec. We're going to create it in the resource group Polar Bear, and we're going to give it a name Polar Bear template, and we also need to give it a version which is going to be 1.0. And of course this is not going to work, so we're going to do AZ group create -- resource group Polar Bear -- location West Europe. All right, what did I mess up? Required properties are missing from object properties. I've never seen this error before. Invalid schema. Maybe I need to add something like template file and then the file that we're going to publish. This is a thing that I noticed a lot with the latest additions to template spec, deployment stacks, and also Bicep, is that you get the weirdest of errors. Because I would expect a meaningful error saying, hey, you stupid, you forgot to indicate which file you wanted to add. But of course, I should have known that invalid schema means that. Now we can now go into Azure. Let me make that a little bit bigger for you. And find our newly created resource group. And here's a template spec as a resource. So that's the thing that somebody has to see. I can now navigate to the details of this template spec. And you saw me add a -- version. So I can have multiple versions within the same template spec. It says what's the latest version. I can go to versions, and then I can see the list. One thing that I can now do is I can go here and say deploy, and then I can deploy the template spec directly from the portal. So I've given quite some thought to valid use cases for deploying something using infrastructure as code and then deploying it from the portal. And I think I found one. You have a team of data analysts or data engineers that sometimes need things like Databricks or databases provisioned, but they're not really into Azure infrastructure. This is a way for you to write a template that you publish as a spec, and then they can deploy it themselves from the portal. I just made that scenario up, but I can see this working. And of course, there are similar personas as data engineers. Now, if we're talking about template specs, another thing that I can do is I can create a new template and say something like var is whatever. Save this as temp, and of course this is demo 3 by now. And I can now say I'm going to add a module, and the symbolic name for this is of course module 1. And then instead of referencing a file, I can reference a template spec. And the syntax for this one is quite complicated, so I hope you forgive me that I'm going to look that up. Right here, because it needs to be TS : subscription ID / resource group name, which was polar bear, and then the name of our spec, which was polar bear template, and then I think the version has to be a colon again. Now comes something cool. No, not that. Ta-da! In the background, it pulled the template from Azure because my logged in credentials have access to the template. It parsed it, it found the parameters for this file, and it generates the outline for deploying this thing for me. And of course, if I don't provide an object here, but a string, it will tell me again, I'm an idiot. So this is one way for reusing templates as a template spec. Does that show you everything you wanted to see?
Would you organize the specs in like one resource group of specs, or where do they meet? Because it's kind of resources or something, then somewhere that library of FIQ things and so on. So it's like still as a resource. There is a specific way how you organize it, where you say central subscription where everything lives in your reference also.
It depends. That's a bit of a naughty answer. If I, for example, create a template spec that I want to use to deploy landing zones, and I have like 5 or 6 templates with variations on the landing zone, I would put them in my management subscription in a specific resource group that only the platform team can access. But if I am creating best templates that Geert talked about as well, which I share a vision about with him, I don't really believe in a central team pushing out templates that are basically just templates wrapped around templates and adding a lot of abstraction and complexity without really adding value. Then I would put them in a resource group again in the management subscription, and probably fix something with rollback RBAC assignments to make sure that everybody can read those. If you create them for a specific team or a specific business unit, I would push it out to their subscription. But I really see this working if a team has to do a lot of infrastructure and they want to build a repository for themselves and they don't want to do it in Git. And then it's probably just a resource group of your own. So that's some considerations. But it really depends on your context and your individual configuration of your Azure environment.
So what do you see as main differences between private registry and template-based and maybe main use cases for both? And just as a protocol compared to, let's say, deployment environments.
Okay, so the question is, how would I contrast the Bicep registry with template specs? A template spec is a resource in itself, which means that if I go into the portal, it has its very own identity and access control entries. So I can assign very specific RBAC assignments on individual specs if I really fancy managing all those individual RBAC assignments. On the spec level, well, let's try something new. Well, what do you know? Even on the version level. So, and what would that enable for you is if you want to deprecate something in a larger organization, you say, well, this is deprecated, and everybody would say, mm-hmm. And nothing happens. But the first thing you can do when something is deprecated, remove access to it from everybody who isn't using it yet, and then try to slowly strangle that usage. So that's the thing that you can do with individual RBAC assignments. In the Bicep registry, you are relying on the internal authentication properties of that registry, which to the best of my knowledge, because I don't do anything with containers, is non-existent. But that's on a very limited knowledge of the container registry. So the alternative is deployment environments, and you're probably not referencing to the thing in Azure DevOps environments, but the thing in Azure. I've never used it.
It's pretty horrible.
Sorry?
It is pretty horrible.
I would never say such a thing.
It's
Without taking a look first.
It's one of those overlapping services that does some of the same things.
I think we had dev test labs, which didn't really take off. Out of curiosity, who is using code spaces? Who has ever, okay, so one person, awesome. Who has ever tried it? Okay, why didn't you use it? No reason to? Okay, no reason to. Anybody who said, well, that's a very expensive replacement of my desktop? Because that's the thing that I hear a lot. I don't really see all of these things taking off in my very limited environment, honestly. So contrasting it, deployment environment, don't use them. Personally, I would shy away from both probably. I am a firm believer in per application having your own set of Bicep templates and not sharing too much. And what I've seen working very well between a number of applications is just copy pasting the templates out. And the big benefit there is that both sets of templates can evolve individually for the individual application needs. The one-size-fits-all approach doesn't really work if you really want to iterate on your application infrastructures, in my opinion. The only counterexample that I can think of is the virtual machine. If you still deploy a lot of virtual machines, it makes sense to have a template that deploys the extension for joining it to domain, the extension for enabling AAD logins, the extension for enabling DSC, some DSC stuff. That's one of the templates that I see actually having so much length compared to the amount of parameters that really adds value. That's some random thoughts. Hope that helps.
So with the template spec, that's a resource itself, so you deploy something. So with the template spec, because it's kind of resource, so that you will otherwise deploy with a Bicep as well. So what's like, do you need CI/CD that will connect and push it, because you run the command manually? So you will need like pipeline for it most probably. If it will go to the registry, you will have CI/CD pushing it somewhere like ACR versioning and so on. So what will be the like life cycle management for this one, and how would you actually run it? Would you run a Bicep to push this to the like Azure, or the AZ command is the only option actually there, because it's a resource in a way, it's infra resource? And
then your stance is we don't deploy it from the local machine, we want to go through pipelines.
Yeah. So like do you have any like, do you know what will be the good practice? I mean, it's a new thing, maybe it's not established, maybe the way to push it using AZ command, but
I would write a Bicep template to deploy that template spec. But what I've seen teams do more and more is that they actually don't use the tasks, but use the CLI from within their pipeline. And I even see them do things like ./build.ps1, because then they can really do the same thing on their local machine as they do on the build server. So I see them fewer and fewer using the very specific tasks that are created for Azure DevOps and probably also for GitHub Actions, but instead just build a .ps1 that contains the Azure CLI commands. There's also just a one-liner for doing a zip deployment. And the cool thing for them is that if they want to debug their pipeline, they can do it on a local machine, and their feedback cycle is way shorter. And I do have feelings about that, but that's probably, I'm a bit shy to admit it, I'm linking on to something that I've learned a couple of years ago, because I do see them iterating faster on their pipelines that way.
And if you have something deployed with like version 1.0, for example, and then is there a possibility to upgrade to version 1.1 somehow, or like those are just...
No, there is no automatic increment, because if I redeploy this again, I will get a warning saying, hey, you're going to override an existing version. Is that what you want to do? And of course, I'm very confident I don't make any breaking changes, so I'm going to say yes. But generally, you probably want to increment it yourself. But if you have that PowerShell file which executes that ASE command, it's just another infrastructure as code thingy, but now not in Bicep, but in PowerShell. That's what I've seen. And I don't see a lot of template specs in practice, honestly.
Thanks.
Any other thoughts?
One cool trick you can do is remove your CI/CD pipeline permissions from those template specs. Then when a cache expires, you'll have a great time troubleshooting what went wrong, because it expires later than the permissions actually do.
Sorry, can you repeat that? I didn't catch
Yeah, so
that.
if you remove permissions to template specs from your CI/CD pipeline, the troubleshooting time you will spend on making it work again is fun, because the cache of the template spec load expires at some point other than when you remove the permissions, so be careful with that.
Okay, so actually you used the mic, so I don't have to repeat the comment. Thank you. Shall we move to deployment stacks? Okay. So here I have prepared an example. So what did I do? I create a fantastic demo template, this time not using an app service, but for variation a storage account. And what I'm going to do is I am going to AZ group create -- location West Europe -- name IglooConf. I'm going to have a great time tomorrow cleaning everything up. And now I can say AZ stack create. My name is going to be demo stack. In that resource group IglooConf. And my template is 07 deployment stacks demo.bicep. And I'm going to say deny settings mode is none. So what this is doing is going to create the stack for me. And as you can see, that's not working. But I can create is misspelled. AZ stack create create. Seems okay to me. Why? Oh, why? Oh. Because we're going to create a stack at the resource group level. And what's the mistake now? Oh, template. This is always the point that I hope that I'm not the only one who always has to go back and forth between -- help and documentation for finding the correct parameters. But we're finally deploying our stack. So we're creating a stack with the name demo stack. So this is the virtual line around the resources. In this case, just the storage account. And for the remainder, it looks a lot like the regular deployment command that we know from AZ deployment group create. And the other thing that differs is the deny settings mode. This is about locking of the stack deployment. In this case, I'm not locking it because that's very handy when you're giving demos. But here I can, for example, say lock against deletion or lock against update and deletion. And then there is another parameter that I can use to specify exceptions, which is where you would put in your service principle that you use from your pipeline. If we now go back to the portal, to resource groups, refresh that list, go to IglooConf, and here we have the storage account. So this is nothing different. But I can now go to deployment stacks, and what I see here, hey, there is one stack called demo stack, so there can be multiple in a single resource group. And in that stack, we see a single resource with that fantastic name. If I now go back to my demo and I make this name even more fantastic, and by adding a 2, and I'm redeploying, it's going to say, hey, you might detach resources and resource groups because this is not the first time you're deploying this stack. And of course, confident as I am, I press yes. And only now I'm going to ask, who wants to predict what is going to happen?
There will be 2 storage accounts there, and the other one will be detached, so it's no longer in the stack.
Spot on. So we will have 2 resources in Azure, one with the legendary name and one with the legendary name 2. And if we go to the stack, we will see that the second resource is now in the stack and that the first resource is in the list of detached resources. And that list will always show the resources that are detached in the latest deployment. Of course, this is taking a while. So let's go back to the portal. Let's see if we can refresh the details of our resource group yet. Oh, there you go. The second resource group is added. And if I now go to my deployment stack, demo stack, and refresh that, here the predicted outcome, we can see that the new account is part of the stack, but the old account is detached. So what do? We go back to Visual Studio Code, we update this 2 to a C, and then redeploy. Confidently press yes. Anybody want to launch a prediction on what we're going to see?
Everything detached.
Everything detached. Okay, based on what? What's your reasoning? What we will hopefully see is that we in the stack now have storage account C, ending in C. We have no detached resources because there are no resources detached in this latest deployment. And we will see that number 2 is removed both from the stack and from Azure. If, and only if, when you're giving a demo, you don't forget to add -delete resources. So that's not what we're going to see. And now I can't abort this deployment because it's just going to continue in the background. So we have to wait for a few seconds for this to complete.
Without that delete, then wouldn't it do the reverse? You would put first in this kind of state, but then detach them.
Yes. So we will get 3 storage accounts in Azure. We will get the second one in detached state and the third one enlisted in the stack. So what this does show is that once resources are detached, it doesn't retain them as detached for all the time. Okay, now let's now update this to a 4 and add top of mind. It's probably like this.
What's the use cases where you would not like to run delete resources?
If you sorry, 1 second please. -- delete - resource -- delete - what is yes, there we go. So the question is, when do you don't want to remove resources but just detach them? If you want to avoid mistakes. So if you're in a company where everything is done through infrastructure as code, you're and you have your identity and access management in order, you can be confident that nobody went into the portal and changed the setting or added the resources or otherwise was a person that didn't follow the guidelines. But if you are, as an organization or a team, transitioning from traditionally managing stuff in the portal to infrastructure as code, and some engineer just created a database with very important information a couple of weeks ago, and by accident it isn't in the stack yet, and because deployments are idempotent, you want to avoid that database getting removed by accident. Of course, you can guard against that by logs, but when you're in that transition, I can imagine that you want to make sure that you don't make mistakes. One thing that I've asked the team is if we can get an extra property on every resource is part of stack. Because then, as an architect or an engineer in the team, I can query for all the resources that are not part of a stack. So I use it as like an intermediate state where I know I'm going to delete them, but I just want to look at that myself before it actually happens. So that's the scenario that I see. And I think we are all willing to admit that we sometimes have executed a CLI command without the proper flags. So I think this is a real scenario.
Is there a way to do kind of alerting on those detached resources actually? Because following up the scenario you described, natural consequence would be, yeah, I forget to add it to the stack. I was experimenting, etc. So the actual deployment makes that detached. So it would be perfect to alert there is a new detached resource.
Yes, but to make that possible, there are two ways. The one that I would love is a extra property on the resource. It's part of stack, and that property also being null, so like not part of a stack. I talked to the deployments team about that, and the answer is very difficult, and that translates to not going to happen, but not going to say that, frankly. The other option is that you can use the graph. The Azure Resource Graph to query all deployments and all stack deployments, and you should be able to find all resources that are detached in the latest deployment. But you
can have it as a follow-up job in the deployment pipeline.
Yeah. And you have to run that frequently enough to make sure that there are no 2 consecutive deployments, because the detached state in that stack of the list of detached resources in that stack is going to not retain that resource between deployments.
Well, I guess probably the easiest way to achieve that is to actually have it as a step of the deployment pipeline, as a verification, and if that returns something, that simply block further deployments until it's resolved.
Yes, you need to remove parallelism as well. I still like that property on the resource itself, so I can just give me all resources that match this condition. Probably not going to happen.
Actually, can you, is it shown in Azure Monitor or to like that in telemetry monitor that you have detached resources? Because I would like to see them in log analytics.
That is a very good question. Let's find out together. So this is my resource group that we have been messing with. So I go to the activity log. It can take a couple of minutes for entries to show up here, but maybe we are lucky enough. I wrote a deployment stack. Right, great. And then of course we get into this. Today I have to just click the line. Dun, 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 dun. Message. So I definitely can find writes to deployment stacks, and then because the stack deployment is a resource in itself, which is retained, I think, for 800 times as well, just as a regular deployment. You have a resource ID that you can at least query for a while, so that's one way. But then you have that indirection, which is not cool. But I don't think I see the individual detachments here, because I only see delete storage account. We can dive deeper into that later, but I think it's a very niche question, maybe not spend 10 minutes on with the whole group, unless everybody wants to see this. But I think it's not there.
If it's not something that I need as a developer, but our operation team, they would like to see that one.
Yeah, because
When they are running our product.
because in most organizations, a lot of Azure spend can be saved by just removing stuff you don't need anymore. Is there anything else you want to see, or do, or talk about? Shout, heckle, sing, dance.
One clarifying question. The
Yes.
deployment stack, they are resource group specific, so you can't target deployment across multiple resource groups?
The question is, can you target multiple resource groups? Yes. There is support for deploying a stack, for example, at the subscription level to create resource groups and make that resource group part of the stack as well. That comes with its own individual problems, because now I create a resource group which is part of a stack, so that's going to be removed when I remove it from the stack, but somebody else comes in from the side and deploys 2 new resources in that resource group. What to do with those resources? They are not part of the stack, but they are nested in an entity that's part of the stack. So there is another flag which is -- delete resource groups, which you can use to say, hey, I really want to remove the resource groups part of this stack, even if there are resources in there. And you can also deploy them at the subscription level. So if you're with that cloud adoption framework enterprise scale in the back of your mind, yes, there are a lot of things that you can now do with deployment stacks.
They are visible in the subscription resource level, the deployment stack?
Yes, because what do you know? COF demo. Deployment stacks. Here they are. So we're running out of time, and I do want to give Johnny enough time to set up as well, because I know I appreciate it when I have to present. There's just 2 things that I want to say. You didn't ask about support for Enter ID. If you start looking at that, know that you shouldn't look for something like Microsoft.enterID/groups or /applications, but you should look for Microsoft.graph, because what they're actually building is a resource provider for Microsoft Graph, which allows us to hope that a lot of resources that we can access using Graph eventually will also become available using Bicep. The biggest showstopper there is idempotency on the underlying Graph APIs. And the other thing that I want to point out is if you want to see that larger example or have other questions, feel free to find me. I'll be here all day, but tomorrow I have to leave pretty early to catch my flight. So find me if you have any questions. Thank you for your attention.